Okay, part two, Andrew Jackson's administration. We're just going to look at two of the primary crises of the Jackson administration: the Indian Removal Act and the nullification crisis with South Carolina. Let's see here: Indian policy and a Trail of Tears, and then the Tariff of Abominations. That's what the people in South Carolina and the issue of nullification. We'll talk about these guys later. Now, Jackson supported the rapid expansion in the West, which meant that Indian policy was very important for Jackson. Jackson does not support any notion of assimilation of these Indian tribes into our culture. Jackson believes the Native Americans need to be pushed out. Jackson views the Native Americans as obstacles to progress, when it comes time to be hard on this issue, they become savages and primitives and things like that. And so Jackson is not going to support. As a matter of fact, in 1819, there was an attempt to assimilate a small tribe into a surrounding community. The government only invested about $10,000 in an attempt to smooth the process of this assimilation into this group, and it didn't work. It failed to accomplish that which they wanted it to do, and so we stopped attempting to assimilate native populations into the area. So in 1829, Andrew Jackson basically declares that Indians cannot hold on to lands that the states want to develop. If the states have settlers that they want to develop in land, that the Indians can't hang on to the land, and they will be removed. The federal government will provide two things. Number one, they will provide a place to take the native populations, and number two, they will provide a military assistance in relocating the Indian populations. So the Indian Removal Act isn't necessarily the federal government removing all the tribes. It's the state governments asking for federal assistance in removing the Indians. Okay? Now, interestingly enough, during this time period, in the Congress, Davy Crockett is the congressman from the state of Tennessee. Crockett and Jackson are friends up to this point. Jackson and Crockett are friends. Most people view Davy Crockett as potentially being the next president of the United States. The problem is Indian removal. So prior to Jackson starting to do all this stuff, Jackson tells Davy Crockett he wants to groom him for the White House. See, at this point, Crockett is like a rock star. The stories about, the tall tales about Davy Crockett have started spreading all over. These authors of these dime novels, they have him lassoing Halley's Comet out of the sky. They have him jumping the Mississippi River in a single bound. They have him killing over 100 bears in a single season. They even have him wrestling with a bear and trying to, what's the expression? Trying to grin one down, right? The bear bares his teeth and Crockett bares his teeth. And so he's even able to grin down a bear. So Crockett's got this kind of Herculean kind of legend that's risen up about him, and clearly exaggerated, but this is what the populace thinks of him. He's the subject of all these dime novels. So Jackson tells Crockett, everybody knows your name, now they need to get to know you as the man, as the politician. And so he sends Crockett on a speaking tour, and so Crockett starts visiting the other states in the North to campaign to potentially make himself well known enough to where he could become the next president. While he's gone, Andrew Jackson pushes Indian removal through Congress. Crockett, even though he's a friend of Andrew Jackson, Crockett is a friend of the Native American populations, especially the Cherokee. As a young man, he lived for 3 years with the Cherokee. Crockett was not in support of Indian removal or any of these kinds of ideas. While Crockett was out on his campaigning trip, he is informed by somebody about what's going on in Washington. See, we don't have CNN, and we don't have texting, and we don't have all that stuff back then. Crockett jumps on the first stage that he can get and makes it all the way back to Washington on the day that they're scheduled to vote. And as part of the congressional record in 1830, Davy Crockett takes the floor in the Congress and he blasts Indian removal. He blasts Andrew Jackson. He blasts the whole idea, trying to sway people to get them to not vote, the other congressmen to not vote for Indian removal. Unfortunately for Crockett, most of the Congress agreed with Jackson. Most of the Congress agreed with Jackson. This is going to hurt Davy Crockett in the next election, because when he comes up for the election the next time, Crockett's going to get voted out of office. And it's this that sends Davy Crockett to Texas, where there's another Tennessean who used to be friends with Andrew Jackson and got really had a massive rift over Native American populations, the former governor of Tennessee, Sam Houston. Sam Houston, Davy Crockett, both Tennesseans who go down to Texas because of their conflict with Andrew Jackson, destroys their political careers in Tennessee. So I blame Andrew Jackson for the death of Davy Crockett. It's his fault. It's his fault. However, eventually in the next couple of videos, I think it's the next video, we're going to talk about the Alamo. Texas does become the most successful colony that Tennessee ever planted. Huh? Can I get an amen?
Amen.
There we go. Most of my friends from Texas don't like to hear that, but that's only because they know it's true. They know it's true. If it weren't for Tennesseans, there would be no Texas. As a matter of fact, when Texas is annexed as a state, a little aside, it was James K. Polk who annexed it, another politician, another president from Tennessee. So, anyway, Indian removal passes through the Congress despite Davy Crockett's assertions, and they move west. Resistance was futile. Earlier in 32, the Sac and the Fox find out, they attempt to resist this removal, and the military, the army's there to put down their resistance. The southern tribes proved to be a little more resistant to removal. As a matter of fact, the Cherokee are going to take them to court. They're going to take the state of Georgia to court. And this is kind of interesting, what happened. Of all the tribes in the southern sort of eastern woodland area, the Cherokee are the one who are in fact assimilated the most. They are the ones who are assimilated the most. What's going to happen to these guys is they're going to challenge the Georgia law that removes them from the territory. Because again, the federal law, Indian removal, only provides the reservation and transportation. It's the Georgia law that says they should be removed from their territory. So the Cherokee take it to court. The Supreme Court decides that the Cherokee were correct, that their understanding of the law is correct, that the Native American population, Native American nations, are what are termed by law dependent sovereign nations. They are dependent sovereign nations. They are not bound by the jurisdiction of any state laws or county laws or city laws. The only only law enforcement have jurisdiction over them are federal law enforcement officials. That's the way it is to this day. If there's a crime on an Indian reservation, the Native Americans have their own reservation police. They have their own police force. If it's something they can't handle, the local sheriff or the state police cannot come onto the reservation with any authority. The only groups that can come on to the reservations are the FBI, the DEA, and the federal marshals, federal law enforcement agencies. So what the Supreme Court determined was that Georgia is not, the Cherokee Nation is not bound by Georgia law. Now, to be quite honest, this is still the law to this day. Up in New Jersey, there was a very, very small tribe in New Jersey called the Pequot. The Pequot. Not a very large tribe. Most of them have been wiped out, but they're still there. The Pequot, since gambling was legal in New Jersey, right, casino-style gambling, the Pequot opened a reservation. The Pequot opened a resort with a casino on it. The government of New Jersey said, ha, more revenues, because New Jersey was going to tax the gambling revenues like they do in Atlantic City. The Pequot said, oh no, dependent sovereign nation. And so the state of New Jersey said, we'll see about that. And they took them to court, and when it gets to the Supreme Court, what was the decision? They are a dependent sovereign nation not bound by any state legislation. Now, if you go to one of their casinos and you win more than $5,000, they will report any winnings above $5,000 to the Internal Revenue Service, which is required by federal law. However, they don't have to obey any state law on the reservation. So, in the aftermath, what happens? You get reservation casinos popping up all over the country at this point because the states don't have control. The states don't have control. So this notion of dependent sovereign nation is still something that actually is still in existence. And that was a contemporary example. Now, Jackson is furious. Jackson says, if the Supreme Court, if the Chief Justice wants to make this declaration from the bench, let's see him enforce it. So what Jackson does, in complete and direct defiance of the decision of the Supreme Court, he sends the soldiers to North Georgia and removes the remaining Cherokee. Okay? Most of the Cherokee had left early. Way back in 28, 32, times like that. The Cherokee from this region, 1835, are the last ones to be removed from the region. Look, everybody talks about the Trail of Tears as if it's synonymous with Indian removal, but it's not. Indian removal is all of the tribes: the Seminole, the Creek, the Chickasaw, the Chickasaw, the Cherokee. All of the tribes from these regions are removed and sent to the Oklahoma Territory, right? So it goes beyond, across the Mississippi River to this Oklahoma Territory. This territory, that last patch of land that was left over from the Louisiana Purchase. The Trail of Tears is the late movement of the Cherokee during winter, terrible condition, where thousands of these people are sent to this very northern trail to go over here and stop in this Oklahoma Territory. The Trail of Tears is just one small part of Indian removal. All of the other tribes are removed in mass so that we can settle in those areas. And then the promises that are made, as we'll find out next semester, which aren't kept, is Jackson even signed these not contracts, these treaties with these tribes. The Great White Father promises that as long as the sun shines and the grass grows and the wind blows, you will have this land forever. Oklahoma, as we move them. Now, most of these people don't know how to live there. They don't know how to live there. They have to learn all over again how to farm this kind of land, how to hunt this kind of land. They have to learn how to live in a place that is nothing like what they were moved out of. Okay? But for Jackson, now Jackson looks at this Indian removal question as a question of states' rights. The state of Georgia, Jackson says, has the right to decide what to do with its land, and no Native American population is allowed to hold that land. No federal agency is allowed to force them not to do with that land what they want. So he claims it's a states' rights issue at this point. See, that's a big problem considering the nullification crisis. Even though Indian removal was, in his excuse, a states' rights question, he supports a very strong tariff to protect American manufacturing industry. Now, it's really kind of surprising that Jackson supports this tariff, since it is part of Henry Clay's American system. It is really kind of interesting that he would still support it. But our industries, our manufacturing, is losing the battle against these European manufacturers. And so he strongly supports this tariff. Now, the tariff hurts South Carolina really, really bad, especially South Carolina. Because South Carolina sends its rice crop all over the world, and then they receive in exchange manufactured goods in return for this rice crop. The problem is, when those goods come to port, the farmers in South Carolina have to pay the tariff. They have to pay the tariff on the imported goods, on the value of the imported goods. And so it really, really hurts South Carolina. Now, John C. Calhoun had been the vice president under Jackson, okay? And up to this point, they were friendly towards one another, except John C. Calhoun is kind of a upper crust of Southern society. John C. Calhoun is going to draw up a legal document to give to the South Carolina legislature. This legal document, called nullification, if you'll remember the lectures on where Thomas Jefferson and James Madison wrote the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions, which nullified the Alien and Sedition Acts. What Calhoun's going to do is draw up a statement of nullification, explaining how nullification would work, how a state government will nullify a federal law within its jurisdiction if it believes the law is unconstitutional. So he draws up that document for their legislature. Then he resigns his position as vice president. He resigns his position as vice president. When he does that, one of the senators from South Carolina also resigns his position, and the governor of South Carolina appoints John C. Calhoun to retake his place in the Senate. Now, as vice president, all he does is hold the hammer. He presides over the Senate, but he doesn't engage in legislative action. But now, as a member of the Senate again, he can help to push to get rid of this tariff, and so he's going to push, and he's going to make an enemy of Andrew Jackson. He's going to make it, like I said, Andrew Jackson has two speeds. I either love you or I hate you. And that's most people's attitudes towards Andrew Jackson at the same time. So he takes his Senate seat. In 1833, South Carolina declares the tariff null and void in their jurisdiction. We will not collect the tariff. Now, we've already talked about this idea before, this notion of nullification. Madison, author of the Constitution, believed that states had the authority to nullify the dictates of a piece of legislation if they felt it was unconstitutional and unfair to their state. Okay? It should drive it into the Supreme Court. We took the example of legalizing marijuana, and just specifically Colorado. I asked the question the last time we talked about this: can the federal government, can the DEA go into Colorado and start arresting people for smoking marijuana and selling marijuana? Can they?
Yes.
Yes, they can, because it's against federal law. Recreational use of marijuana is against federal law. it is according to the law, a Class 1 controlled substance. It's not legal. What Colorado did was declare that law null and void in their jurisdiction. They will not enforce that law, which allowed for them to have the recreational use of marijuana. Now, it's supposed to drive these things into the Supreme Court, to make those decisions in the Supreme Court. But there's also a third. So the third option is the option that's happening in the country now is the government just does nothing, which I think there's reasons for that. But what Jackson does is Jackson is going to force compliance. He's going to force compliance. Jackson sends the Navy to Charleston Harbor, and he tells the Navy, when you get there, if you have not heard from me, you destroy Charleston Harbor. You open fire on Charleston Harbor and destroy it, right? He declares their actions treason. He has the Congress pushes through something called the Force Bill, which authorizes this use of force against his state government, because he's going to force his state government into compliance. So a president could go to Colorado and start arresting all the pot store owners and all the people involved in the pot business. That would take it to court, and that would be, but for Jackson is going to take this hard way, okay? Quickly, Calhoun and the other members of the Senate start revising this tariff, start coming up with a new tariff that's not so damaging to the economy of South Carolina. They finally, just before the Navy arrives, they finally come up with a tariff that's not as damaging to South Carolina, and South Carolina withdraws its nullification. They withdraw the nullification, and they start paying a smaller tariff. States' rights questions are not over. We will be hearing about them for the rest of the semester. But Andrew Jackson is not as simple an individual as he wanted to. This idea about the nullification crisis, this is a function of a large, powerful, centralized government, not a question of states' rights. States' rights, well, where's South Carolina's right to nullify the tariff? As long as it violated Andrew Jackson's plan, it wasn't going to happen. So these are two of the primary crises that happened during the Jackson administration. By the time we get to 1836, Andrew Jackson is, we're going to wind up having the, actually I think that's what we're going to discuss next, is we're going to take a look at the difference between the Texas War for Independence and the Mexican-American War, which makes Texas a state. So this section, just a couple more videos before it's time for your exam. The Joyous Celebration, excuse me, I meant to say Joyous Celebration. The Joyous Celebration will open on Friday. Everybody has until Sunday midnight to take the exam, and then we'll be finished.